And Judy, there'll just be a little message there for you.
Okay. Oops. And I just hit continue. Okay.
Okay, great. Great, so I show 1 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started, folks. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for today's webinar with Judy Semroc. I'm really excited to have Judy with us virtually today. We were supposed to meet in person with my volunteer pollinator specialist class up at Hiram College this month to be out there in the field with Judy looking at asters and goldenrods and some of those great fall plants. But of course, all of our in-person things were postponed this year. Judy contacted me a month or so ago and said, you know, I'd love to still do the program. Can we do it virtually? So I said, that's great. Let's put together a Zoom. And we found a date that worked. And I'm excited to have Judy here with us this afternoon. So Judy is a conservation outreach specialist with the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, an amazing naturalist educator in the classroom and also out in the field. And Judy and I have known each other for quite a while. She was the middle school science teacher when my kids were in elementary school at Canton Country Day, so quite a few years ago now, but got to know Judy then and really appreciate her knowledge in a lot of different areas in natural history. She's co-author of the Dragonfly and Damselfly book for Northeastern Ohio, and just an outstanding naturalist. Judy, I'm going to go ahead and check on some of these mutes here and mute myself and pass the podium over to you. Thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having this work and putting all the effort into it. And thank you everyone for joining us today. This program came about because many of the people who I speak to were either cutting things back or already getting into the fall season and not necessarily having things blooming. And I was trying to give some information about the importance of why now having these things that bloom from now till basically frost, why it's so important. So the image you're looking at here is white snake root, and I'll talk more about that later, but it is actually a native plant, but this shot was taken along Lake Erie during the time that the monarchs were coming across the lake during migration. And there was a bank of this plant that had just come in, I think, as a little gimme. And there were so many monarchs that were nectaring on this plant. It was just amazing. And it was part of the impetus to get this moving so that people realize that as these butterflies are coming across the lake, they're actually really, really hungry, and they need to have they need to have food. So I sort of liken it to if you're going across country and you've got your family all packed up, and if you're back in the day, you're in the old station wagon and you don't have any rest stops along the way, well, you're not going to get very far. So the idea is to try to make our yards little mini fueling stations for these species. And this plant in particular is one. It isn't blooming right now, but it is soon to be blooming. And we'll talk more about it when we get to this section. So what's in a name? Unfortunately, a lot of people, when they hear the word weed, they think, okay, I've got to pull it out, I've got to spray it, I've got to get rid of it. But the definition basically is a plant that's considered undesirable in a particular situation or a plant in the wrong place. Some of our best plants, which possess high pollen and nectar content, are labeled with, you know, weed in the name. So immediately they're considered weeds like milkweed and jewelweed, sneezeweed, and all that sort of thing. But just looking at these plants, we now have changed in our estimation of their importance. A lot of this had to do with, and the setup had to do with the farming community, because back in the day, it was all sort of based around what was good. Didn't want the cattle grazing on this or that. So a lot of these plants were then deemed as being weeds and then either gotten rid of or removed from the field. And now we do a lot of spraying, and we need to get away from that sort of thought process. And I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I'm sure I'm speaking to the choir here with all of you folks, that you know a lot of this and that you know how important they are. And then think about berry and fruit producing plants as well. So as those fruits are available now and further into the fall and into the winter, this is when the birds need them most. The photograph that can you see my arrow on the photograph to the right? That is a pokeweed that again was up along the lakefront and was totally encased in ice, but there were birds that were picking at the berries in the dead of winter, trying to get that extra little bit of energy. So, you know, there's a lot of importance in these fruits and in these flowers. And that's more about what we're going to talk about today. So on the left, you see the orange jewelweed or spotted jewelweed with the spicebush swallowtail, sneezeweed next, and then the ironweed with tiger swallowtail. So in order to extend the flowering time of LSB is late season blooming plants, you can go in, say you have a big section of asters or say you have a section of Joe Pye or whatever. If you go in and cut some stems out, that will encourage it to start new growth, and you can actually induce those new blooms to follow the current blooms so that they actually last longer into the season that these migratory species and these pollinating species are still out and being able to use them. So as we have new waves of migrating insects and birds coming through, they will appreciate, you know, new flowers, new nectar sources. So you don't have to cut the whole thing down, but even if you cut them back, depending on the species, cut them back, you know, 6 or 8 inches or a foot or so, it doesn't take them long to send out a new set of blooms to extend that bloom time. So some reasons of why you want to plant late blooming plants. First of all, the nectar really does aid in migrating species. Think monarchs, hummingbirds, and then also think about the food chain. So if you're bringing a lot of insects into your yard or your home habitat, then you're also going to bring other species in that will then feed on those species. So you get quite an assemblage of insects and birds that will come through and use that. Bumblebees, honeybees, and overwintering butterflies like the commas, question marks, mourning cloaks, they need to gather and use nectar as food in their food reserves for their winter survival. So since they overwinter as adults, they're going to need to go into basically like a hibernation. And if they don't have enough food stores within their body, then it's very difficult for them to make it through the winter. Also, the late blooming plants aid other insects such as flower flies, that's in the lower right corner, katydids, grasshoppers, and many more, which then become food for other species, again, higher on the food chain. This middle picture here of the hummingbird that's on the cardinal flower, basically I just cut mine back a little bit so that a new bloom comes up and so that the plant actually can last longer for a bloom time. And the hummingbirds basically right up until the time they leave are using those plants. So very, very important. And remember, about 60% of the hummingbird's diet in the summertime is actually the small bugs that are visiting the flowers. So not only are they getting nectar from your feeders and from the plants, but they're also able to take those tiny little insects that may be inside of the plants that they are feeding and nectaring on. And then again, our fall gardens can make a significant difference in providing nectar sources that otherwise would be lost to herbicide use, pesticide use, excessive mowing, late season drought. I mean, we've certainly up here in Northeast Ohio have not had a bunch of rain lately, so things are really drying out, and you can really tell on some of the flowering plants. So, and again, habitat destruction is always one of those things that we deal with on a regular basis. So your collective yards can really make a difference by building sort of a patchwork that they can visit. Also, the migrating dragonflies and insect hawking birds, such as common nighthawks, kestrels, and even the smaller owls, can feed on the insects that nectar on late season flowers. So we have several species of migrating dragonflies. And if you've never been out in the late summer or early fall and been in an open field and watched hundreds, maybe even thousands of common green darners or black saddlebags or wandering gliders that are all flying over these meadows, that's what they're doing. They're hawking insects because then they will continue to fly south. It's only a one-way migration. They don't come back, but they have to have enough fuel and energy to make it down to, say, Tennessee, northern Georgia, places like that. And again, there's the common nighthawks. If you're a birder, now's the time to be out watching for them because they've started their southward migration. And people have already commented that they've been seeing them flying. And if you watch them dip and dive, you know that they're doing that to catch, to catch the insects. And then again, allow your plants to go to seed rather than deadheading them in the early fall. Remember, our birds that stay here over the winter, those seeds, in addition to the actual stems of the plants, there's a lot of species that lay their eggs in those stems, not hoping that they'll actually be there in the spring when those eggs can hatch. But in addition to that, if a lot of people might deadhead or they clear their gardens to make it look what they consider nice and tidy for the winter, you are removing, in some cases, the next generation of these insects that we really like to have around. So maybe if you just lay them down rather than moving them or removing them and just keep them in situ, in place, that way next spring, whoever needs to hatch out still have a way of doing that. Now there's some really good sites that I've been following and some good information that's been coming about. And so the next 3 slides are going to talk about this, this new research that's being done, and also through, from Doug Tallamy, but from some other papers that have been written. So the amount of available or usable nectar and pollen that plants possess can differ greatly by species. So there's quite a bit of variation between perennials, annuals, weeds, and cultivars. And the 2 main items that are measured are the nectar sugar mass and the pollen volume. Well, Doug Tallamy's been working on just trying to discover or trying to research whether or not the nativars are actually harming or hurting some of our species. And what they're finding, or for example, a clone is basically a repeat of original genetics. So there's not a lot of diversity there in clones. But in disease resistance, so some of these nativars or some of these that have been worked on and scientifically altered so that we can maybe take out the disease components such as the elm, the chestnuts, and that. The new ones, the cultivars, are actually doing well with our native insects. They are visiting them. Doug's doing, more intense research and going basically species by species. They did, one of the other areas that they were researching was variegation in the leaf color or patterns. And they did find that the more variegation in a leaf, it seemed to be less attractive to insects. Remember that our insects basically are visiting these plants because they actually evolved with these plants. So when you introduce more changes to a plant, whether it's in the nectar content, the pollen volume, the color, the height, all of those things have a great bearing on who in the insect world will visit them, because they're going based on their genetic history with them. And then some of these that have been cloned to have bigger fruits, such as our berry population, it seemed that they also are supporting more insects than the straight species. So there's more to be done there, but keep your eye out on that. We're all always very excited when Doug comes up with some new information and can educate us. So that's an area that's going to be very interesting to follow. So the Ecological Landscape Alliance, if you're not familiar with them, they actually they're involved in a lot of different things, but there was a study done in 2016 and 2014 that basically confirmed that non-native plants are providing an abundant and potentially very valuable resource in the nectar department. Basically, they now have formulated with all the research that the native pollinators are just as happy and sometimes even prefer to use the non-native flowers when they're available. So as we know that as our climate is changing and warms, that our native pollinator assemblage will change. And yes, some currently non-native pollinators will become new natives, which in addition to the same thing with plants, as they're moving further northward and we're getting species here that were typically more southern species. We'll have to just see how the insects not only deal with it, but will those insects that normally would pollinate or nectar on them move northward as well. So combined with the usefulness of non-native species in other aspects such as the flowering season, aesthetic appeal, cultural importance, we shouldn't be excluding them from being planted simply by virtue of their origin, which I really like that line. And again, in focusing on the nectar rewards was sort of a focus of this talk, because the more I'm out, and I'm sure the same for you, the more you might be seeing insects nectaring and potentially pollinating plants that we don't normally have in our arsenal because they are considered to be non-native or invasive, but not so much, but just plants that have formally and historically been left out of the mix. So the sugary concentration in nectar is really the key determinant of the flower quality of most pollinators, because nectar is the key source of energy. And then the second factor is the volume of nectar produced by different flowers. So for example, some plants may seem to produce very little nectar, and others of plants that produce high sugar concentration in its nectar and lots of it are really going to be the ones that are highly attractive to many pollinators. And then the protein composition of nectar can also be important, particularly for butterflies, as this is their key source of adult nutrition. Nectar high in amino acids is believed to be then higher quality for them. So this was one of the tables that came out of the research, and what I would like you to focus on, the top row are annuals, the middle row are perennials, and then the bottom row are weeds. And this study was done in England and Scotland, and it's actually fairly recent. It's been done in 2014. Some other research was added to it in 2016. But if you notice the little dots, so the measurements along the bottom are in micrograms per day, and it is measuring the nectar sugar mass of the floral unit, so basically of the flower. And it goes from 0 on the left up to 3,000 on the right. And if you look at the annuals, they start slow at 0 and then they come up. And the best annual is about at 800 micrograms per day. And that's actually, if you follow this, is the list is in order by what's the highest. So they put like the top 10 and then the top 15 and then obviously more. But this is Bachelor Button on the right, Cosmos, and then Calendulas. Those are the 3 top annuals as far as the amount of nectar that they are producing in their flowers. If we step down to the perennials, you'll see that the blue dots go up even higher. So now they're at like 1,800 if you follow it down here to the graph. And the high ones are, this is Hawkbit to the right here. Centaurea, we all know those, as Denise is going to tell me that, you know, here's another one that's not on our, it's on our list of not being a native. But again, look at the values and how high they are compared to some of the other ones that are down here. And then the Echium, we'll talk about that too, is one of the ones that we will see Viper's blue goss, and I've seen hummingbirds and all kinds of things nectaring on that. But then we move to the weed category, and you will see that the farthest right dot is showing us the almost up to 3,000 micrograms per day, and the top 10 or so go way over here, still offering 500. So we're looking at Senecio, we're looking at Cirsiums, which are our thistles, and then of course, you know, the fourth one down is Dandelion. So we tend to take these plants and get rid of them, and rightfully so on some of them. Canada thistle is not a favorite. It's also allelopathic. It's putting chemicals into the soil to give it a, you know, give it a heads up and a head start, and being able to cut down on the competition. But we do have some native thistles that actually would be really good in planting. So this was a particularly interesting, you know, set of facts, but let's take it one step further. So if these are just a couple of things that we could consider. Red clover, while it's down in the weed end of things, actually on that chart, it's considered a perennial because this was an English site and a Scottish site. But red clover is one of the best plants that you can have, not only for what it adds to the soil nutritionally, but also what it entices for the insects. The other one below it, that's our dandelion. And if you're not familiar, if you go out in the spring when the dandelions are blooming, that is one of the best and first nectar sources for our spring emerging insects. When there's not a lot of other things blooming, the dandelions get a lot of visitation. The bumblebees are on it. Obviously, the honeybees come out, they're on it. But all of our early butterflies actually seek out dandelion to nectar on. In the middle row, talking about the perennials, this top photo is of swamp thistle, which is actually a native for us. And while it normally is found in bogs and fens, it does very well in your yard. And if you want to watch a lot of butterflies and a lot of other insects, plant some swamp thistle, or plant some of the other thistles that may not necessarily be as aggressive as Canada thistle, but will be very enticing. The bottom one is our Viper's blue gloss, which is the echium. And again, the hummingbirds like it because it's got that, throaty little flower to it, and a lot of insects visit it as well. And then on our annuals, we have the bachelor button and the cosmos. We're basically the top two providing nectar. Even though it's not as much nectar as some of the others, it still is a good one because it adds color and it adds food when a lot of things either are in between blooming. So again, your focus is to have a lot of blooming plants happening over a long period of time. Because remember, if you're an insect and you come out early in the spring, then the plants you're going to be nectaring and pollinating are those that are spring ephemerals. They come out early in the spring. And then when they're done, if you're laying your eggs on any of those plants, then you better get going because otherwise they're going to be done and back underground. And so remember, the plant also has a lot of dictation as to what will pollinate it. Time of year can be very important. All right, so let's get into our goldenrods. We're going to talk about some factors about them and get into some identification, but nothing real lengthy because we could be here for days. So there's more than 100 species that have been described in goldenrods. There's only one species native to Europe and Asia, with a few found in South America. But the greatest goldenrod diversity is in North America, where we have approximately 60 species found coast to coast. Ohio has 21, 22 native species, and the reason there's more than one number there is because when we did our goldenrod book, which has a lot of great information, including tables and photographs and measurements and everything, and a key, there we went by the plants that were in the museum's herbarium, and some of them were brought in that they're now in the area, but they're not necessarily as what we call a true native to Northeast Ohio, but they are native to other parts of Ohio. So the goldenrods support more than 430 types of insects and arachnids, which use them for food or parts of their life cycle. And then they benefit from the insect interaction because their pollen is so heavy, they need an insect to carry it from plant to plant in order to pollinate. So here we have our honeybee. We have, here's some of the buds of some of the goldenrods. Obviously bumblebees love it. Goldenrods are just getting ready now to come into their own. The ones that are blooming now, if you find them and have the red stems, cleverly enough, they're called early goldenrods. So more than 1,000 flowers are produced on a single plant. And the fact that they bloom in late summer and early fall is really critical to the monarchs that are, and other species that are actually making their flight southward. And then our native bees rely heavily on this nectar because if they are going to hibernate for the winter, again, they need a food store to make it, whether they're under a log or underground or in the leaf litter. Bumblebee species need a steady supply of nectar through the fall or they won't make it through the winter. And then in the winter, when the goldenrods go to seed, they provide a valuable food source for things like siskins, chickadees, finches, juncos, small mammals, all kinds of insects can benefit and mammals can benefit. So let's look at the plant, look at the flower. We're going to kind of go through this quickly. These are just some terms that you probably already know because they're part of our whole biology of the pollination, and from pollination to seed to and flower. But goldenrod belongs to the genus Solidago and Euthymia, the subcategories in the sunflower family, so they're Asteraceae. So the blue circle, basically it's taking one of these flowers, and I just enlarged it a lot so that you can see that is an individual goldenrod flower, and that's called a floret. Now, if you go one step further and you look at that actual flower, in the flowers that are in the middle of the head are called disc florets, and you can see they have 5 petals, and they're fused into a tube which runs down into the base of the actual flower. And that's called a disc floret because they're around this outside part. Then the ray floret is the part that has the potential color to them. So in goldenrods that may not be as yellow, you find that their ray florets are actually a pale cream or almost white. So the ray florets are what we would consider like a real petal. And that's, again, if you're looking closely at the flower. And then, of course, you've got the style that comes up through the middle of that. And then there's the stigma, which has got the pollen catchers at the end. So as an insect passes over them, has pollen on their body, that then gets transferred to the proper structure on the flower so that it can get pollinated. And then the anthers are actually the pollen producers. And again, depending on the actual plant itself, remember that if it really wants to get pollinated, it's going to put its nectar way down inside the plant so that if the insect comes and is trying just to get nectar, the pollen is going to transfer to the hairs on their bodies so that they can then take it to the next plant. Each flowering head is surrounded by a bract called phyllaries. And in goldenrod, these bracts can overlap each other like shingles on a roof. And in asters too, we'll see the same thing on asters. But these phyllaries, their positioning, the way that they actually lay on the flower, actually can help you with your identifications. So that's what the phyllaries look like. Some of them will be almost reflexive, or they will branch out and hang down below the flower, and we'll see more of that. One thing I do like to tell people is most people that because they're sneezing in the fall, they think that it's because of the goldenrod, so they go in and cut it all down, when in reality we know that it is ragweed, and the allergies come from the fact that the goldenrods bloom at the same time that ragweed blooms. So because ragweed pollen is light and dry, it is pollinated by the wind. So here is the leaves of the ragweed, here are the flowers. If you are a plant that is pollinated by the wind, like grasses and sedges and ragweed, you don't need to have a showy flower because you're not necessarily needing to invite insects to come and pollinate that flower because you are using the wind. Whereas the goldenrod has a heavy and sticky pollen, it is not carried by the wind. It needs to be carried by the insects. But the fact that the ragweed pollen is out there blowing around when you're out there trying to see all the cool insects on your goldenrod, therein lies the problem. Now we do have 2 species. There are 17 species in the US. Some are annual, some are perennial. But we have 2 species in Northeast Ohio. The common ragweed, which is the one most people see. But then we have this other one that I just think is so cool, is giant ragweed. The flowers are really pretty, and there are small little flies and little tiny little bees that will actually go up into that flower to try to get to the nectar. And they're small enough to do that. And they're also pollen eaters as well. But this gets to be a tall plant. The giant one does, 5, 6, 7 feet with these big palmate leaves. But when you look at the flower up close, it's actually really pretty. Okay, so let's talk more about the goldenrod plants. We find galls on goldenrods a lot of times. Sometimes there are the ball galls, which are these that you see on the left. And sometimes they are the leafy galls in addition to a ball gall on the same plant. But sometimes if you look really hard, you will find a spring peeper that kind of hangs out in the leafy galls, because sometimes those leafy galls, if it's not been really dry, they actually retain some moisture in where the leaves meet the stem. And the little peepers like it because it's cooler and moister than just being on another part of the plant. So the galls make a difference. Some species only have a certain kind of gall on them, and you can actually identify some of your goldenrods by the galls that are on them. But the galls are the visible evidence of an insect-goldenrod interaction. So the gall is the plant's response to be invaded by an internal herbivore, which means, you know, one of the insects will come along, whether it's a fly or a midge or some of the other species that will make galls, and they will inject an egg into the stem as the plant is growing, usually near the top where the more succulent part of the plant is. Once the plant detects that it's got a foreign material in there, it starts to grow this odd-looking structure, whether it's a ball gall, the bunch or leafy gall, the elliptical gall, or the blister or spot gall around that invasion, which is in most cases an egg. And as the plant grows, the gall grows. And when that egg hatches, then it's going to feed on the plant material that is in the gall. And the idea is that it will have enough food in the gall so that it doesn't continue to move down the stem and get to other parts of the goldenrod. So these ball galls can be, the size of, say, a large grape to the size of a small golf ball. And then there are about 50 insect species that produce goldenrod galls. And their type of gall can vary and the species of goldenrod they choose. But in general, the life cycle is uniform. And we'll talk more about that. I'll tell you which ones have a specific gall for them when we get to the plant. Now, if we were to cut the ball gall open, this is what we find inside. So you see this little larva. This is a fly species that creates this, lays this egg and makes this particular type of gall on this goldenrod. But you can see there's a larva in there. So it looks like a little maggot. And basically what it's going to do is it's going to continue to eat throughout this gall and even go in through the winter and stay in that stage. And then in the springtime, when it's time to come out, they make a hole, it goes out to the end, and out they come as the adult. But if you are an enterprising woodpecker, for example, and you find these will then turn brown late fall and into winter, you actually can land on this and you can tear into it with your bill, and you will find galls that actually have like a woodpecker hole in them, where the woodpecker has gone into the gall and taken out this delectable little larva and eaten it. So some of them don't all make it into their flying creature. So there are many types of insects that use goldenrod for food, shelter, and the completion of their life cycle. Bumblebees will often hide under goldenrod stems to roost for the night. So if you're outside on, say, a night hike and you've got your black light flashlight or a regular flashlight, look underneath the goldenrod stems, and many times you will find the bumblebees roosting there. Same thing, here's our honeybee gathering pollen. You can see the little pollen baskets on the legs. There's just so many things that will use it. Day-flying moths, butterflies, flies, wasps, and beetles can all be found nectaring on goldenrod. Male mosquitoes, when you're out at night looking at goldenrod flowers at night, not only do you find a wealth of different moth species, but you actually find the male moths, male mosquitoes, that are putting that nectar and pollen into their sperm packet to pass on to the females, because it's really the females that give you the sting and the bite, not the males. So during the day, again, here's, I mean, how would you not want to have this beautiful plant with all these great common buckeye butterflies nectaring on it? Same thing with our hair streaks. They will also use them, not that they are ones that migrate, but they are doing their fueling thing. And then we also have species that can only use goldenrod, and that's called being monophagous. So we have at least 8 moth and butterfly species that feed exclusively on goldenrods. And then there are many more that can feed on goldenrods, but can also feed on other plants. The asteroid, this caterpillar that you see on the right, you can see how well it blends into the goldenrod, but it will eat both the flowers and the leaves and the stem. Same thing with our brown hooded owlet. That's another one that you can find on goldenrod stems a little later in the season. And of course, the goldenrod leaf beetle. And yes, you know what this is coming out the back end of it. Of course, I didn't mean to take that picture right then in the action, but you never know. We always learn something from those kind of shots. So again, these are all species that use goldenrod specifically, and it's very important that they have that plant. Same thing with the predatory insects. So praying mantises, true bugs, spiders can all be found hunting prey on goldenrods. And the idea is that they look very camouflaged so that their unsuspecting prey don't see them. This photo here you see is a praying mantis, which has caught a monarch. And unfortunately, the little sad face is because for us up here in Northern Ohio, Northeast Ohio, we don't ever see the Carolina mantis, which is our native mantis. It's pretty much been replaced by the Chinese and European mantises, which are both non-native. Being the good gardeners that we were back in the day, we would order the egg cases for the praying mantis so that we could put them in our gardens to eat the aphids. And of course, we were given all non-native species, which are the two that we now see most often up here. The same thing with another great true bug, our green lacewing, which is a wonderful predator both as an adult and as a larval form. It will hunt across the top of goldenrod flowers. And then the fabulous goldenrod crab spider that you can see here, but again, very well camouflaged. So if a little skipper or something lands on the end of that to try to nectar, they're in trouble because they will be part of the process. So I'm just going to give you a little gallery on a few species of goldenrods that are going to be ones you will mainly see. This is the one that is starting to bloom now. Those of you further in Southern Ohio, you will have, this one's already in bloom for you. And again, most of this is talking about how it affects us up here, but this works for the whole state. There is common throughout Ohio, fields, roadsides, disturbed sites, just about any place you have a field or even a ditch along the side of the road, you will find it. 2 to 4 feet, it's common, starts blooming late in June in the southern part of Ohio and then runs into early September. The heads are broadly pyramidal. Glabers are smooth within and below the flowering area. And then the leaves are smooth on both surfaces, upper and lower. And then they become progressively smaller as they work their way upward from the base. So this is the earliest goldenrod to bloom. And one thing you'll notice with a lot of goldenrods is that the heads, the flower heads, are basically on one side of the branch. So you'll see the branch here. They all sort of point upward. So if you look carefully at the flower, you can see that all of these are pointing upward and the stem is below it. So that's early goldenrod. Lance leaf is the one that a lot of people know because it's got these very skinny, narrow leaves. And again, it's another one that can be found in just about any type of habitat. Starts blooming in August, runs through to October. It's mainly flat topped. The stems are straight with stiff hairs on them. And then if you turn the leaves over and looking at the underside of goldenrod leaves is going to be something that if you really want to learn your goldenrods, you'll get used to doing that. But they have these veins, these 3 to 5 parallel veins, and you can see where the arrows are pointing. They're parallel to the midrib vein, but you can look for that, and that's one of the ways. But most people know this one right off because of the skinny leaves. And then again, this is the only flat top goldenrod in immediate vicinity of Cleveland, but it's everywhere now. And this is the one that will have that black spot or white spot gall on this species. So you will see that pretty often as well. Zigzag goldenrod, this is one of our woodland species. It likes hardwood forests, more frequently found on alkali soils, but not always. It makes a wonderful plant for your woods if you've got a small little woods. Again, floodplain areas, it's good with that. It gets about 2 to 3 feet tall. It can be very common in the right habitat because it can form colonies through rhizomes. It blooms from August to September. The flowers are mostly in the axils. So if you haven't noticed, the print, if it's in a different color, it lines up or matches the arrow that's pointing to that feature on the photograph. So that can help you sort of orient things. The stems can be bent at each of the nodes, so they have a little bit of they'll hit a node and then they'll bend to one side and then they'll hit another node, bend to the other side. So the stem can appear like angled or ribbed. The leaves have a lot of sharp toothing on it, so you can see here. And then as you get higher up in the plant, the upper leaves are smaller than the lower leaves. And this happens a lot with a lot of goldenrods. So they like the deep woods, they will like woodland edges, and again, they can form colonies. You can have a nice stand of them. And a lot of times you don't have a lot of flowering plants in the woods at this time of year. So look to the goldenrods and look to some of our asters, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The blue stem is another one that is a woodland species. Again, it can live in a lot drier of a habitat than the zigzag goldenrod, 2 to 3 feet tall. Again, common in the right habitat. They bloom a little later in September. The flowers are found in the leaf axil. So you can see where the leaves meet the stem, that's the axil. And then when it's totally in bloom, you can see how it looks there. And the stems can be somewhat reddish. Some are paler in colors. And then again, the leaves get smaller as you move toward the top of the plant. The larger leaves are down near the bottom. And then they can really arch in branching, especially if you have a nice mature colony. They'll look really pretty. Tall goldenrod is one that is mostly seen because it's very tall. But we learned a valuable lesson when we were writing the goldenrod book in the fact that we used to call all of the really aggressive tall goldenrods, we called them all Canada goldenrods. Well, when we were creating the keys and looking for the plants to do all of our measurements, we found that we really don't have Canada goldenrod in Ohio. We had to actually go to Canada. And we had people sending photographs from like upper part of Michigan and things like that. So when you hear the term Canada goldenrod, it's not really a species here for Ohio. And when going through the herbarium, we found that many of our goldenrods that were labeled Canada goldenrods were mislabeled. So tall and late are the two that you will find as the taller goldenrod species that tend to be more aggressive or tend to spread more. But they are very similar looking to true Canada goldenrod, and hence the mix-up. So again, they get tall. They can actually get taller than 6 feet. They are starting to bloom now. They'll go into September. And again, you'll have a lot of flower heads on the range, mostly again on one side of the stem, like we talked about before. This is the goldenrod that you will see the ball gall on. So you see this circle, sort of a violet circle here. That's the one that mainly gets the ball gall. And then the leaves are lanceolate. They have 3 veins, 2 prominent midribs on the underside, and there's a slight toothing to the leaf margins. So again, these 3 species, late, Canada, and tall, can be very, very similar and can be very confusing. Now, you get an open meadow like this, and you're going to have everybody that's either migrating or needing nectar to come and visit. So if you've got the room or you've got a place that all you have is a bunch of turf grass, think about putting in some of the other species of goldenrods that may not be as aggressive, but certainly provide a lot of great food. Okay, then we're going to move into the asters. And again, there's so many more identification features on these plants, but we just can't do it all. We'd like to do it all, but we can't. Again, asters are one of the most important late season pollinator plant groups. We currently have 35 species, 5 of which are rare. They are split into 6 genera, but the largest one is Symphyotricum, which is 25 of the 35 are in this genus. The sugar content in aster nectar is actually pretty high, 24 to 40%, 41%. And the ray flower colors range from white to pale lavender to blue to purple. And that's mainly what you see are the ray flower colors when you look at asters. And then asters can be found in just about every habitat type, and many do well in home garden settings. So doing the same thing we did for the goldenrods. The asters are part of the composite family, which is Asteraceae. The flower head is composed of 2 sets of flowers. The ray flowers are the colorful ones, so these will be the ones that look more like a petal. The disc flowers are these 5-petaled flowers that are in the center of the flower. And the disc flowers typically are yellow, but in some species they can be reddish or maroon in color, and we'll talk about that too. Again, the asters also have phyllaries, and those are the bracts that surround the flower head. And in some of these species, the phyllaries, depending on their position and how they lay and how thick they are, and if there's space between them, that all is very helpful in identifying aster species. So this is just sort of a worksheet when you're trying to determine what type of aster you have. Look at the color of the ray and the disc flowers. Look at the general size of the flowers. Is it a massive collection of a bunch of color on the end of a branchlet, or are they more spread apart like in this lower photo? The number of ray flowers, are there few or many? That has bearing on species. The flower groupings, are they crowded as a grouping, or are they sparse? Are they rounded or flat topped? And then along the stems or in distinct flower heads. The leaves, do the leaves clasp the stem? Are the leaves, bigger or smaller as you go up the stem toward the top? Are they smooth or fuzzy? And then again, noting sizes between the upper, middle, and lower or the basal leaves. The branches, meaning do they branch outward or are they more concentrated into the center? And then the overall plant height and the overall general appearance. And then what habitat are they in? Some of these aster species can only live in certain habitats, and that helps with an identification. So let's just go through a few. These are ones that you might see more often, but here are some asters with blue, purple, or lavender flowers. The New England Aster, which is the upper left photo, is probably the one that most people see. It gets tall, it's very vibrant in color. But we also have purple stemmed aster, hence the name because of the purple stems, smooth aster, and then crooked stemmed, or we also have zigzag aster, like we have a zigzag goldenrod. And then we also have another light blue one, which is the blue wood aster, which is a woodland edge type aster. And then we have asters with white flowers. So the white wood aster, the flat topped aster, which is more, the wood aster obviously lives more in the woods or woods edges. Here's the flat topped aster here. And if you were to do a comparison, so when we said in a previous slide to look at the number of ray flowers as opposed to, let me back up a second here. So we talked about here that
it's okay.
You have to the number of, let me go one more here for you. So if the ray flowers, which are the more that look like a petal, are there many or few? When we go and look at this white species, look at the number of ray flowers on this flower as compared to the number and size of ray flowers on the panicle aster. So panicle aster ray flowers are much narrower. Same thing on the flat-topped asters, the ray flowers are much wider. So again, these are all things that you can look at and will help you to identify aster species. And then of course the frost aster, which also holds its flowers until frost and can actually stay even longer. And then the calico aster is one that we see a lot in open meadows and woods and fields. And it's got the centers that can be more than just yellow. They can be sort of a red or maroon color also. So just a little brief description of some of the aster species. This is our most common one that people probably recognize. The New England Aster, field, road size, woodland edges, 2 to 4 feet, blooms from now until early November. And again, those of you in middle to southern Ohio, these are already blooming for you. The heads are a pinkish, purplish, lavender color. The stems are covered in these soft hairs. You can see down here in this lower left picture all the little hairs on the stems. And it's rough. If you feel the stem, you can feel that the texture of that stem is rough. The leaves clasp the stem, so you can see where the yellow arrow is, showing the clasping aspect of the leaf. And if you do crush the leaves, they do have a fragrance to them. Most people describe them as being spicy. They do attract a variety of bees, butterflies, and other pollinating species. This is the host plant for the pearl, one of the host plants for the pearl crescent butterfly. And here you see a mating pair of pearl crescents. And here's the little larva down here, which really doesn't look like much because they're not very big. And then this is our largest of the purple colored asters and can be very obvious from a distance. The purple stemmed aster is one that is actually a favorite because late in the year, there's not a lot of blue and purple colors of flowers. So a lot of people like to find these and plant these. Again, they do like to be in a more wetter habitat, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be totally wet. They like to be around the edges of areas that might have some water to them, a ditch or something like that, and wood and water edges to streams and things. They start blooming in late August, go into early October. They are lighter in color than the New England Aster, and they have fewer flowers on the top. So the actual top head of the plant is more open than what the New England Aster was. The leaves also clasp, and you can see here where the yellow arrow is that this leaf is clasping the stem. And the stem also has these stiff hairs. Typically they're reddish purple in color, but not always. Sometimes you find them and they're not. So, you know, they can be difficult. Asters and goldenrods can be difficult because not all of the features are on every plant all of the time. And again, they're very attractive to our pollinating insects. And one thing that you can tell, here are these filaries, and you can see how they arch and almost to the point where they may even reflex or point downward. This is a good identification feature for this particular aster. The white wood aster. So if you're in the woods and you find an aster with heart-shaped leaves, and they can get to be quite a stand of them, as you can see in this bottom picture, it's likely going to be the white wood aster. Woods edges, it can do dry soil in the shade or mostly shade. The groupings can be large, 1 to 3 feet, starting in early August into late September. And again, mostly flat topped. They don't really have much of an arching to them, but the flowers can be very abundant and they are yellow in the center. Excuse me. And the main stem can be somewhat crooked. So if you see the red arrow, you can see that when it comes to a node of a leaf, it sort of bends in a different direction. So it's not a straight stem. And then the leaves are heart-shaped with teeth on the edges. And then the lower leaves are distinctly stalked, which means they aren't clasping to the stem. And then again, they're very attractive to a lot of the pollinating species, especially those that hang out in the woods. The flat-topped aster, this is one that we see in an area, but this is probably the #1 white aster for people that ask me where they can get seeds for them, because they would love to have the Harris's checker spot, which of course is a very rare species, come back into Ohio and be found. That is the food plant for them. So again, you'd find them in meadows. They can be wet wood edges, meadows that get a little more water than most, although in many places they'll grow in regular areas just like lawn grass will grow. They can get tall, 4 to 7 feet. They're in bud now up here, go into early October. And again, they are mostly flat topped if you look across the top of the flower cluster. And then the middle typically is yellow when they're first opening, and then it goes to sort of a cream color after they've been open for a while. Again, attractive variety of bee and butterflies pollinating species. And here's the Harris's checker spot, butterfly and caterpillar. So our species of the Harris checker spot took a real big hit when we were spraying for gypsy moths, because of course we sprayed way out of the realm of where the gypsy moths might be in order to put an end to that, but we instead really sufficiently took care of that population. Okay, so talking about Pollinator Heaven, if you look at these various views, you will see that probably the biggest thing you see is diversity. Upper left, this was a planted meadow that was on a private property that the people just wanted to attract as many butterflies as they could. So they put together a grouping and had it all tilled up and sprayed the invasives. And it turned out to be about 8 or 9 acres of this meadow that you see here on the right. This is from the Estelle Wenrick Preserve down in southern Ohio near the Dayton area, which if you ever get the opportunity to go to the Midwest Native Plant Conference, this was one of the areas that we would do field trips in. They planted the milkweed that you see there, swamp milkweed, and it was fantastic. It was a very wet meadow. They broke up all the drain tile, and the habitat has just turned into this wonderful area of all kinds of natives, but in particular, because the meadow was wet, the swamp milkweed really took off. The lower left is an area for those of you up in the Northeast, if you're familiar with Springfield Bog. They actually picked up all the farmland around the bog, and this is Summit Metro Parks, and went in and planted it as a prairie / meadow, and you can see all the natives that are in there. But the really cool thing about it in doing so, then they started to get dick thistles would visit, all kinds of the good sparrows, because there was cover for them and a lot of food, because there were, not only would these plants go to seed, but they also provided plenty of opportunities for the pollinators. And then this on the lower right was a garden that was done up on one of the islands, one of our Lake Erie islands. And they did it with a group of kids. So they planted some annuals with some perennials, and they were doing it mainly for color and having it be sort of the red, white, and blue look to it. But there were more dragonflies hunting over this field because there were so many insects that were nectaring on these plants. So there's a lot of ways of doing it. But again, think about diversity, diversity, diversity. The more different flowers that you plant or that you have with the different types of locations for the nectar and the pollen on a given part of the flower, the more that you will invite the insects, and then everything else comes along with it. So I'm going to talk about some other plants here that aren't necessarily native, but this is the plant that was the opening slide. This is our white snakeroot. Again, it is native to Eastern and Central North America. It's found in a lot of different habitats. It can come up in just about anywhere. It's going to be blooming now or soon for us here in the Northeast. The flower color is white. A lot of people think it looks like a Joe Pye or a bone set, but it's not. It's its own little plant. But these flowers are very, very attractive to all types of pollinators, including other insects that aren't necessarily pollinating but are looking for nectar. But all parts of the plants are poisonous to people and pets. So don't eat it. If you've got any concern about that, then of course don't plant it. But I think according to Denise and I were talking about this at the onset, this is considered a noxious weed in Ohio because back in the day, this was known to give milk sickness. It has a toxin in it called trematol. And back in the day, when the cow's milk was not filtered and combined with so many other sources of milk, this was actually a problem. And if you do any historical reading on it, you'll find that this was the sickness that Abraham Lincoln's mother died from. Again, because if the livestock was feeding on this, it would affect the milk. But that trematol does help to keep this plant from being eaten by the deer. So, you know, there's a little silver lining everywhere. Again, one of its distinguishing features is the fact that it is so attractive to a variety of insects, both pollinating and nectaring. And again, if you look at this as just one little cluster of the plants, you can see the bumblebees, the small native bees, the monarchs, and of course, then you can see one of our, this is a question mark, comma in that group. Again, feeding constantly across the top. The other thing that's nice about it, this is more of a flat top plant. So some of the bigger insects can actually land on it like a landing platform and use it. Great blue lobelia. It's one of it usually blooms longer than our red version, but if you cut some of the reds back, they'll resprout and have some flowers that'll last longer. Again, our native moist habitats, floodplains, wet meadows, but it does well in garden settings as well. Gets 1 to 4 feet tall, various shades of blues and lavenders. So each flower is split into 2 lips. And so if you look at one carefully, please notice this because it's very cool looking. The upper lip has 2 segments and the lower lip has 3. So if you look at this lower lip, you'll see these 3 segments. And if you look at the upper lip, you'll see that it has 3. But remember, in the insect world, our insects see UV light. So they see things on plants that tell them where to go. And if you're familiar with Nectar Trails, you will see that on the underside of this flower, these long, skinny, darker blue lines, that's part of the Nectar Trail system that it's basically saying to the insect, if you want the nectar, come down here. You've got to get inside this flower. The nectar's way down here. But in the process, if you're one of the bumblebees, you're going to get my pollen all over your body. And then when you go to the next flower, voila, pollination can occur. The hummingbirds like this. Again, it's got that little throat to the flower. So useful in many cases. Turtlehead. This is another native. We have the white, which is the real native. We also have this pinkish, purplish fuchsia color that a lot of people have in their gardens. Again, found throughout the eastern half of the U.S. It likes, the white one typically is stream banks, areas around ponds, more damp, wet meadows, 2 to 3 feet tall. It does have square stems, and the leaves are opposite, narrow, toothed. They bloom from late summer into fall. The flower color, again, that white to that pale pink. But then there are some cultivars that have other colors that look a little different. But this is the larval host plant for the Baltimore checker spot. So this is the butterfly. Here is the larva or the caterpillar. And you'll notice that that larva looks a lot like the Harris's checker spot. But if you find the Harris's checker spot, call me immediately. That would be very cool. And then again, this, if you look at the lateral view of the flower, it looks like a turtle head poking its way out of the upper shell. But again, it's loved by bumblebees because not a whole lot can crawl inside of this flower to get to the nectar and the pollen that's in there. You can see inside, these are open a little bit more. But again, you can also find that this plant can be nectar robbed by bumblebees. They'll actually go to the very base of the plant, chew their way in, and actually get to the nectar and bypass the pollen. So, you know, they do things like that as well. But again, you can find, sometimes you'll be out in the field and you'll hear this buzzing, but you won't see the bumblebee, but you'll see the plant moving. The whole plant will move because once the bee is inside of the flower, you can really hear the buzzing reverberate from inside of the petals of the flower. This particular plant, I've had very good luck with. It has been naturalized to Ohio. It's native to the United States. We're at the more northern end of its range, but it is a sage, so it's a salvia. It's got these beautiful sky blue flowers, 3 to 4 feet tall, blooms from September into October. It likes dry soil, full sun. It's more like a prairie type plant. But again, it's another one that is very, very attractive to the insects. And the fact that it's a blue color later in the season makes it desirable by people to, you know, put in their yards or their gardens. So that one is a very interesting species as well. Then again, the Joe Pies and the bone sets, again, if you have a nice cluster of both of these plants and you tend to cut them back a little bit so that they will re-bloom later, that just adds to the excitement of the insect as it comes in to get more food. Other than that, if they all go to seed at the same time, then you've lost that nectar component for later. Again, tall ironweed, black-eyed Susans, Caryopteris or dark night. That one usually dies back in the winter for us up here in the north. But again, it will, resprout. It's more of like a woody, but it doesn't get big. It's actually a small plant. But again, these tubular flowers that the hummingbirds and the butterflies can get into with those long tongues make it attractive. Then we're going to talk about some annuals. Annuals can be very important. This one happens to be my favorite right now because I can't tell you how many insects I have photographed on this flower. Unbelievable. It is a native to Mexico and Central America, but it grows well in Northeast Ohio as an annual. Regular garden soil, sunny exposure, keep it watered 4 to 7 feet. Can make, you know, one plant can get nice and robust and big. It's got that vibrant orange color, reddish orange. It is greatly favored by the migrating monarchs. All the swallowtails seem to just like draw to it immediately. A lot of bumblebees will visit it. Again, the bright orange color really makes it stand out. The leaves are large, so it can really be quite a showstopper as if you have a grouping of them growing. And they can be very easy to grow. You can also grow them from seed and they do well. Purple top vervain. This is one that can actually sometimes come back from seed the next year if we don't have too hard of a winter. But again, it's native to South America. We grow it here in Ohio as an annual. It can reseed. It likes full sun in average garden soil, 2 to 5 feet. You can also extend the bloom time by deadheading, you know, some of them. Starting now, and actually some of these have already started to be blooming. So for us, they've been blooming now even into July. They've got some different cultivars now that actually start earlier. They are very, very attractive to bumblebees, butterflies, flower flies. The hummingbird, this was one that was actually on one of my plants here at home. And so they like it as well. You can see that little tubular flower that is attractive to them. The stem is very sturdy, so some of the heavier insects can land on them, and the migrating monarchs, it's one of their first choices. Pineapple sage. Again, this is one for us, starts to bloom and then invariably we get a frost and it kills it like immediately. So for up here in Northeast Ohio, once it starts blooming, it brings in all kinds of great little species. But if frost is forecasted for the night, you need to cover it. And if you keep doing that for a while, you can get, you know, more time out of it in blooming. But again, it's one that is very desirable to the hummingbirds. And if you live in the southern part of the state, this will bloom obviously earlier, so you have more time with it. For us, it's kind of tough because sometimes the hummingbirds have already started to migrate and these come out and have these beautiful red flowers. So September into October, red to scarlet colors. It is an herb, so it really does have pineapple scented leaves in addition to these beautiful red flowers. So actually, if you have it potted planted in a pot, you can bring that in on the nights, obviously, that are calling for the frost to get some extra time out of it. Okay, jewelweed. Most people consider this a weed, but for us, those of us who like the pollinating insects, who like the nectaring insects, who like hummingbirds, this is a great plant to have. It grows shady, sunny parts. If it's got enough moisture, it'll do fine. It does start to die back quickly when it's very, very dry, hence what a lot of people might be doing now, especially up here because it's been so dry. But creek edges, ditches, wetlands, other moist habitats, it blooms in the shade just fine, 2 to 5 feet. It's starting to bloom now for us. Most of those that are in the sun have already been blooming. There's 2 species, the orange and yellow flower colors. It can easily self-seed and it'll come up next year. And it's also known as touch-me-not. So it's in the impatiens family. So it has that little seed pod that when it's totally engorged with the seeds and ready to pop, if you just touch it a little bit with your fingers, it pops and spreads seeds everywhere. Spring peepers will actually sit on it as well down here in the lower right. Again, because it tends to be in more moisture habitats, which is what they like. And you can see in the lower left where the hummingbird, the bumblebee is going right inside, going all the way to the base of this flower to get to the nectar. And for those of you that are familiar, the sap that is found in the stalk of the plant, if you peel that back, it is really useful with itching from stings, plant irritations, bites of sorts. So it's very cooling and feels good. And then our last one are the zinnias. This is, of course, an annual for us, native to Mexico. Because it blooms for such a long time, it's really useful for these species that migrate. They can come down, the color is bright, it attracts not only the butterflies, but the hummingbirds as well, especially the bumblebees. And there are many different varieties of zinnias. They range in size from, 4 to 5 inches all the way up to 4 to 5 feet. They grow well from seed, so you can plant them out in the spring. A variety of colors. And again, if you have your pots and they're in pots and they're ready to bloom or frost comes, you can bring them in and then bring them back out. But again, another very useful species. Okay, so we're almost done. This is, if you take anything else away from this presentation, it's the slide of the guy laying on the ground with the lawnmower. The idea is lawn grass, and a lot of lawn grass just isn't doing anything for our pollinators, especially if you spray to get rid of the clovers and the dandelions and all those other little species that can be in there. Think about reducing your grass by 1/3 each year till you don't, may not have any more. Those of you that have zoning restrictions, there's ways of working around that. If you mow the first 10 or 20 feet of your yard so that it looks well kept, you can keep the backyard with like a no-mow lawn mix, things like that. Think about your lawns being costly in terms of watering, gas, equipment, loud when people are blowing the leaves around or they're mowing the grass and catching the grass rather than leaving it. And then if you're spraying it or you're having a company come in and spray it, all very unnecessary expenses that you can sort of help out if you try to change what you're doing with your lawn. Again, herbicides, fertilizers, and other chemicals that are applied to make it look like a big lush green lawn. We're poisoning our ecosystem, that all those chemicals get into our groundwater supplies. And, believe it or not, you're drinking it. We're all drinking from the same well, basically. And then, or use rocks, clovers, herbs, mosses, and other short beneficial plants as grass replacements. And for those of you that have dogs, remember dandelions and clovers and other naturalized plant species tolerate pet urine very well. The next several slides are going to be resources. So you can either refer to these later, but this first one is on seed and plant resources. OPN Seed, which was formerly Ohio Prairie Nursery, has a great eco-friendly lawn alternative seed mix, which I highly recommend. Now they have changed their name because basically now they provide mostly seeds as opposed to plants. Prairie Moon Nursery, a great catalog with a lot of good natives that also provide seed mixes. And if you have certain seeds that you want in your mix, for example, OPN will actually put that together for you. The Wild Ones, another good organization that gets into the importance of native plants and natural landscapes. And then LEAP. And I want to tell everybody about LEAP because it's got a great little interactive map on their website. LEAP is the Lake Erie Allegheny Partnership. We all belong to this, many of us belong to this in Northeast Ohio. And when I say us, the park districts, the museum, a lot of the land conservancies pulled together, to create LEAP. And in doing so, it has a great website, but Cleveland Metro Parks helped by putting together, yikes, the map. And when you go to the link, click on the map, and it'll give you all the nurseries in the area that provide native plants. So it's actually a really good resource. And it'll work for all of Ohio, but most of the nurseries that are listed are for the northern half of Ohio. And if you are a nursery owner that provides native plants, then you can look into getting your link on that map as well. moving on, the Ecological Landscape Alliance has got a lot of great information on there. Citizen science projects, also with this native-native-R debate that's being done. They're using a lot of citizen science information to gather the important parts that they're trying to determine how useful or how beneficial the native R's can be. So there's a whole grouping of links there. And then if you try to go for the no-mow lawn or taking back some of your lawn, that is a book on the right. And there is a lawnreform.org organization that's got all kinds of information. This second one down here, this eco-beneficial interview with Doug Tallamy, is very interesting, very good. So if you get the chance to link onto that and watch that, it's actually very good. And then the last slide are just some books that are out there. The Native Asters of Ohio was done by Sigrid Nielsen. She did a great job on the book. It's got keys in it. It's got all of her drawings in it. The Goldenrods of Northeast Ohio, that's the book that we put out with the museum. And there's information through Denise with that on that book. Then, of course, the Attracting Native Pollinators, Pollinators of Native Plants, and the 100 Plants to Feed the Bees. Heather Holm, the Xerxes Society, all of those groups are, put out some really interesting information. One in particular, this top one, this blog from Dennis Profant, he sadly has passed away, but his blog is still online, and he's got wonderful photos and a wonderful section on Ohio Asters. So if you're interested in learning more about that. Also, the second one down, the Ontario website on wildflowers also has a good site on learning the asters. So again, all good information on those last 3 slides. And now we're all done. If you have questions, and as long as they're not hard, I'm ready.
Great, thanks so much, Judy. Folks, I know Judy would appreciate a thank you in the chat pod if you have to run off to another meeting. Thanks for joining us. Judy, I know we had a couple questions as you were going. One was about asters to be aware of, maybe some that are a little more aggressive in the landscape. Do you have any warnings there?
It all depends on what habitat you have. If you have room for some of those that are, say, considered more weedy just because they can take up a bigger section. But what I like to tell folks, and on some of these species, is if you have an area that's covered by non-native species, such as, bad grasses, things like that, put a flowering plant in there, put an aggressive aster or an aggressive goldenrod. The ones that I listed in the presentation, those are ones that don't tend to get as aggressive. Those that were the woodland one, the white one that we saw, the white woodland aster, they can make a bigger colony, but it's not that they're aggressive to where they are blocking out other species. So, there are others that, like I said, in the goldenrods, the tall and the late goldenrods in particular can get and build up a large group through the rhizomes, but there are others that do really well. And if you're able to look through the book, many of those talk about the fact that they showy goldenrod and things like that. They stay where they're put. They don't spread as rapidly. And folks that have smaller areas, you can look at the reference information in the book to pick out those that would work better for you. Some of those that are very rare live in very rare habitats, so bogs and fens, and unless you have one of those, I wouldn't recommend trying to get that and plant it because it won't do well in a backyard situation. So yeah, the plants that I put in for the asters, those are all ones that would be good for, not getting really aggressive. However, the taller aster that was the plant, so if I'll go back a bit just so we can see a couple of these. The flat-topped aster, while it gets tall, it actually is one that you can just go through, and if you wanted to, keep it in an area, it's easily pulled, but it makes a great companion planting with, say, Joe Pye and some of those others that are also late bloomers, the tall ironweed and that. So again, I wouldn't say that they're aggressive. It's just some people don't like really tall things in their garden because their gardens might be small. So some of the taller goldenrods, the taller asters may not be your cup of tea, but it's not that they're aggressive.
Great, thanks, Judy. The other question that we had was, can you just kind of reiterate your comments about cutting plants back, when and how you do that? There were a couple questions related to that.
For example, in my Joe Pies, I have sections of Joe Pye where the plants are large, they're tall, and they might be 3 or 4 feet across and 5 or 6 feet tall. Well, I'll go in with every 3rd or 4th stem, and I will cut that back down to, say, a foot. And then the new sprouts will come up. I cut it about right above where the leaf encircles the stem. So the leaves, come out like a little umbrella from the stem. And I cut it right above that leaf junction. And so that the new stem then will come out above that leaf. And the heads will be smaller, but it's okay because they will last longer. And they will, by the time they grow and get to the point where they're in bloom, some of the other bigger clumps have already started to go to seed. So I will do that with like Joe Pye. I'll do that with the tall ironweed. I'll do that with some of my asters. I'll also do it with bone set. So again, you can take, depending on how big your clump is, you can go in. I do the same thing, believe it or not, earlier in the season when my milkweed is first starting to come up, my common milkweed. The butterflies are nowhere near getting here. So I actually set my mower to about 6 inches high, and I will mow down my milkweed because then it'll set up new shoots, and those new shoots will be all nice and ready to go. They'll be tender by the time the monarchs that need them are up here in Northeast Ohio. So I do that also with my milkweed, but not this late in the season. I do it earlier. So again, a lot of these plants will do very well. It's just like if the deer come by and munch a little bit off, a lot of those will resprout. So think about what you might have in your yard that can stand a bit of selective, I guess it's a pruning in so many words, but it's more for me that I extend the bloom season. And those of you that live near areas where, say you live up along the lakefront and you're getting the monarchs that are just gasping for breath as they come across the lake and they need to stop and get something to drink, your gardens and yards are going to be the first things that they see. So the more that is blooming and the more that is in bloom, even if it's something that you have cut back to allow it to bloom longer, very, very desirable for those species.
Great, thanks so much, Judy. We had lots and lots of thank yous in the chat pod. In fact, Kat says that you're her new hero. We really appreciate your time this afternoon to share all your knowledge, and sure wish we could go together out into the field now and get our hand lenses out and look at some plants, but maybe next year. Folks, thanks for joining us. We appreciate your coming.
Yes, and Kat, give me your address and I'll send that $20 to you. Thank you.
She just wants some seeds.
Okay. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Judy.
Thanks, Denise. Good to see you.
You too.